Welcome to today's webinar, Optimizing Market Access for Medical Devices. My name is Natasha Müllerman, and I'm VP in Strategic Consulting in Cytel. It's my pleasure to moderate this webinar today and introduce our speaker, Bridget Castiles, Executive Advisor. Bridget has extensive field experience in market access, funding and reimbursement, and public affairs for medical technology, including medical devices in vitro diagnostics at corporate and institutional level. Prior to consulting, Bridget developed a long-standing career in medical device industry, including senior positions in major corporations such as Stryker, Medtronic, Baxter, as well as innovative small-medium enterprises. Bridget has in-depth knowledge of medical devices pricing and reimbursement systems, health technology assessment, health economic studies, market positioning, and managed care. Now I will start with an introduction. Why are we actually talking about market access and importance of it? If you're looking at increasing cost and complexity we are facing for the medical innovation, it creates more and more bigger challenge to generate return on investments. We have changing regulatory environment. You're certainly all familiar with the change from medical device directive to medical device regulation in Europe, which are taking place now, and increasing requirements to clinical development, which leads in turn to increasing time and cost to market with the complexity of clinical trials, and at the same time, the risk and uncertainty to reach the positive outcomes still remains. So we have to bear the higher cost and longer development programs, but at the same time, we are facing the pressure from the payers who want the demonstration of the product value from the payer perspective. And there are increasingly different HTA requirements across different countries. So altogether, we are facing a big challenge to generate return on investment for our developments. It is very important to ensure that when we start already developing program from the beginning, we look at the interest of different stakeholders. It's very often that we think of regulatory approval as a main goal, which is certainly very reasonable because we need to obtain CE mark or CDRH approval. But it would be very useful to start thinking very early how we get to adoption to clinical practice, for which reimbursement and coverage is a really critical milestone. So it's very important to start thinking of how we could obtain reimbursement and coverage early on in our development process, because there is important heterogeneity in the way medical devices are assessed by different payer stakeholders. The endpoint evaluation might differ between the agencies, timing to obtain reimbursement will be also different, and the aim of HTAs differs. And in some countries, industry is often not a stakeholder in the process. And also, depending on the country and HTA bodies, early advices for medical devices happens quite rarely. And it's sometimes difficult to have access for small or medium-sized companies. We've seen increasing the time gap between approval and the clinical adoption. There is quite a consistent path for FDA clearance, and there is now changing regulations in Europe. But there is still a barrier to reimbursement. Medical devices company experiencing increasing gap from regulatory approval to reimbursement. We need to satisfy requests from CMS, from local Medicare administrative contractors, and also from American Medical Association CPT coding panel. A very small proportion of devices go before the national CMS office, and majority should be considered by a dozen of Medicare administrative contractor, which are scattered around country, and they might have maybe looking at the evidence requirement quite differently. There are, however, some really positive news recently, as an example of changing on the regulatory front and also on the reimbursement front. If you look at the new CDRH Breakthrough Device Program, which has been published in December 2018, which is focusing on more effective treatments, really breakthrough technologies, focusing on the diagnosis or treatment of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating conditions. And to satisfy to this program, device has to meet several criteria, including that it has to be true breakthrough with no available alternative or significant advantage over cleared alternative, and it has to be the best interest of patients. As of last year, CMS have announced the changes to NTAP program. And now products which are designated by FDA as a breakthrough will automatically qualify for NTAP. What is really positive is that bonus payment will last for 2 years, which would allow a company sufficient time to generate and prove the efficacy, the value of the technology, and collect real-world evidence. And also size of NTAP bonuses payment increased from 50% to 65% of the cost above standard procedure rate, which really allows the new technology to achieve better coverage. So this is an example because certainly there is still a lot of barriers to achieve reimbursement in most efficient timeframes. And hopefully that when clear-cut reimbursement rules would be established for the breakthrough devices, we could expect to see solutions for all the categories. With that, I would hand over to Bridget to go deeper on the challenges of market access reimbursement.
So yes, I will be focusing a lot on Europe, but I'm sure that a lot of those issues and considerations for market access are very global and can be found back in very different countries. So once CE mark approval or regulatory approval has been obtained, and you go with an innovative medical device to market, there's different hurdles that can come on the way to obtaining market access or funding for an innovative device. And that can go through health economic data, budget impact models that are needed, or service impact. How does the new device impact on the way that healthcare is delivered? But it can be as simple as the country or the health authorities not being interested in that kind of in that disease area. So it may be that budgets are directed towards other disease areas, and then you have the traditional budgets and time silos. So another way of looking at this is in this slide. So you get the CE mark, and then you need to go through all the other hurdles. And in the end, there's also obviously the procurement and tenders, because once devices get more commoditized, you get into these kind of negotiations where different values are considered for winning the sale or the tender. For the healthcare systems in Europe, there's 27 countries, there's 27 healthcare systems, but you can separate them out in two big classes of healthcare systems. One is the beverage system, which is a national healthcare system, tax financed, so financed by tax money. And the population is automatically enrolled into that system. Usually, the care is free at the point of care, and there's a gatekeeper system so that patients are guided from one caregiver to the other. While the Bismarck system, which is applied in countries like Germany, Belgium, France, Netherlands, it's a mandatory healthcare system where insurance premiums are financing a large part of the healthcare system, and those are income related. They're separated from the tax money, and the population has a choice of healthcare insurer, which kind of brings in new incentives because the health insurances may have an interest in attracting more customers, so to call it, by offering some additional services. Usually there's co-payments, and services are reimbursed. So there's a payment per service, not a general financing of the healthcare system or of the hospitals. Another way of looking at it is considering whether it's a funding system or a reimbursement. By funding, I mean that there's financial budgets that are provided to, for instance, a hospital receives a global budget at the beginning or at the end of the year, versus a system where services are invoiced for so-to-call to the healthcare system or to the insurances. This makes that the incentives, or the decision maker on the choice of a treatment are very different. So in a funding system where the hospital, for instance, gets a global budget per year, well, the decision-making power is at the hospital level. So your arguments or the value of your technology has to be of interest to the hospital. For instance, they're saving in length of stay, or they may have patients that come back less often, which may be of interest to them. While in a reimbursement system, as such, the hospital does not have a problem with patients coming back more often. Actually, then they will be paid more often. But they are interested still in a shorter length of stay, as long as they receive the full value of the DRG payments. So in a reimbursement system, there's more a centralized decision making in the setup of the payment system of the country, and there is more a focus on cost effectiveness at a NHS-wide scale, and not focus on a single hospital anymore. So as I said, there's different incentives. So you have, and we went through that social healthcare system versus taxation, reimbursement versus benefit in kind, and centralization versus regionalization. So you have countries where the healthcare system is organized in a very centralized way, like for instance in France or in Germany, but then you have countries like Italy, where the decision maker is very much at a regional level. The last block here, access barrier at market entrance versus later, is really about when you get with an innovative device or product to the market. There's markets where if it's really innovative, there's a real barrier. You need to apply for reimbursement and present the clinical data immediately before you can start introducing the therapy into the market, and that's for instance in France. While in other markets, like for instance in Germany, there are ways to already get the product earlier into the market, and then eventually face evaluation of the clinical data at a later stage. So there are common issues, though. So I was going through the difference between the different healthcare systems, but they do have common issues. And what is generally seen is that there is an increased use of health technology assessment, so really of assessing the availability of clinical data for the new technologies. And with the cross-border directive, there is an increased incentive for the different agencies to collaborate, to work together, and that's something you can see, especially in Europe, where once the first health technology assessment has been made by one agency, it immediately finds its way to the other countries. On the contrary, there is still an increasing healthcare cost pressure. There are increasing installation of cost management measures, such as agreements on maximum volumes or rebates that need to be paid once certain volumes of products have been sold, etc. And then there's also, with the use of tendering and the purchasing by centralized purchasing agencies, there is a move from clinical to financial decision makers, where this financial factor starts, or the cost factor starts to be more important sometimes than the clinical part or the quality. So when addressing a market access strategy, in my opinion, it is very important to define first a global strategy, or a strategy at least for the region, and then to adapt it locally, so that everybody, so that you're coordinated over the different countries, and you don't have one story in one country and another in another. So it's really very important to have a global strategy. But then what is even more important is to align the clinical and the market access strategy. Those two strategies absolutely need to focus on the same goals, and I'll go. The next slides will clarify that. Okay, my slides are not moving. Oh, now they moved all of a sudden. Excuse me. Okay. So for a first point to address when you're looking at an innovative medical device and you want to look into the market access strategy, is to have a good understanding of the reimbursement environment, and I call that a bit of a due diligence. Really understand everything about the environment you're going into. So is there already a funding or a coding or reimbursement in the main countries that can be used or that should be used? Is it inpatient, outpatient treatment, or can be used in both in and outpatient? Is there a current tariff funding that's sufficient to cover the new product? And which other products are covered under that code? Because if you have for instance, a procedure code, let's take in Germany, you have an OPS code, which eventually could be used for your innovative device, but it's a very competitive area you're going into, and those other devices that are paid under the same code, they are in a downwards spiral for their pricing. So it would not be very interesting to then put your product into that code, and it may be more interesting to create or to try to find a reason why your product cannot be coded with that OPS code, and another code would be more convenient. So yeah, you will analyze also what the process will be, what the timelines will be, and what the data needs will be to obtain a new code or a new reimbursement. You need to have also a full understanding of the alternative treatments. So what are their codes, what are their tariffs, the budgets, and which could be the most interesting comparator. Because if you compare your technology to a very cheap comparator, well, then you're sure that your ASP is going to be cheap. So it may be worth looking into that into detail. But of course, you need to make sure that the comparator you choose, and that will be then the comparator you will choose also in your clinical trials, is acceptable in most of the countries where you will be launching your technology. You will also investigate whether there's already clinical guidelines in the treatment area, and how open they would be to the introduction of your technology. If there's a negative statement in a guideline about the new device or about the new way of treating these patients, then that could be an issue, and that should be addressed. Is there already an HTA in the treatment area, or also in the diagnostic area, obviously? Is it positive? What's the level of data that was presented? What's the level of data that would be required, and which outcomes were used and were important for the HTA agencies? Is it a priority area? As I said, is it a political priority area? If it's not yet, but you still have a couple of years before the launch of your device, it may be an idea to start increasing the awareness of the burden of illness of the disease area where you're launching your product. And does the organization of care favor the introduction of a new treatment? So is your new treatment really changing the organization of the care, or does it go smoothly into what is already there? Those are all considerations that really need to be addressed before even you start your strategy and your also as an input into your clinical strategy. As an example, I would like to look at the German reimbursement inpatient system. So patients are, the hospital stay for a patient is paid based on the diagnosis codes. If there's also comorbidities, the patient characteristics, and the procedures that the patient is receiving. And all that goes into a lump sum GGRG payment with a cost-based weight and a base rate. And eventually additional payments that could be obtained on top of that. And we'll see that in the next slide. So when looking into, for instance, here again, as an example, Germany, into obtaining reimbursement for your innovation. So what you want to look at is here in the top left upper corner is, can the procedure be coded in the OPS list? Does the description of any of the procedure codes that are out there correspond to your technology? And if you do that, does it lead to a DRG that covers sufficiently? Is the DRG tariff high enough to pay for that technology? If it's yes, then actually you have nothing to do, and it's fantastic. You get immediately a reimbursement, and you won't lose any time. But what should be considered here when you say, well, okay, my procedure can more or less fit into that description? One is that really acceptable? Does it really correspond? But second, as I said before, what other devices, what other procedures are being coded with that same code? And if it's a very competitive area where prices are going down, you may want to have another code which would not be influenced by that downwards spiral. So in case that procedure code is not good, or you would not want that to be used for your device, In that case, a new procedure code needs to be created, and that can be either by a split of an existing code or a completely new code. Once so a procedure code request goes in the month of February for the next year. So then it's, if approved, obviously, it is accepted as from January the year after. But then it takes up to 2 years for it to allow to change the DRG value or to ask for a DRG split to get a higher tariff. During that time, it would be possible for the hospitals to request an innovation payment. And that's the famous NOOPS, which everybody or a lot of people must have heard about. So the NOOP payment has to be requested by every single hospital that would like to use that new technology. And if it is approved, and that's only for really innovative technologies that have a high cost, then the hospital would be able to negotiate a higher price or an additional price on top of the DRG payment. But since a couple of years, if it's a real innovation, it's a high-risk device, and it's a new medical technology concept, then the Joint Federal Committee will do an evaluation of the available clinical data, and if that's not sufficient, clinical data, they will exclude the technology from any funding. So here, before starting with this process, you need to be sure that either it could not be considered as high risk and medical technology innovation, or then you have sufficient clinical data so that the Joint Federal Committee could be convinced and lead the product through. So that's for short-term additional payment. Once the OPS code has been used and statistical data on additional costs are available, so either there can be a DRG split, or you can request for additional payment, which is called the ZE payment, which can be either a fixed tariff or a negotiated tariff. And that's so hospitals here don't have to apply every year, but they need to negotiate with the health insurances every year. So just as an illustration of a thought process on how to address, in this case, the German markets, but then that can be any other market. Your product positioning is a very important part of your choice of strategy. So you will need to decide where is the place of this treatment in the treatment continuum. Does it fall before or after the existing treatment? So is it first line, second line choice? So that also determines your desired patient population. Is it first choice? Is it a subgroup of patients because you think that maybe addressing the full patient population might be too big group of patients and may lead to a much lower selling price? What is the epidemiology? You need to know that. What is the comparator? Is it acceptable to use the most expensive one, or is the standard of care just medical treatment, or you need to actually be sure that you take that standard of care that will be acceptable to most healthcare decision makers. And what are the advantages of your device? What are the advantages that you foresee? So which clinical outcomes can you expect, and which economic outcomes or which economic benefits can you expect to demonstrate. For your product positioning, it's also very important to define whether the new technology is a breakthrough innovation, is it an incremental innovation, is it a Me Too product, and that will define the choice of strategy and the advantages and disadvantages you will have there. So if it's a breakthrough innovation, the positive side is you can sustain that it's a concept of solving an unmet medical need. You can request a premium average selling price. You have no competitor, or at least you have an advantage on existing competitors. And the strategy sustains high-value messages and high-level clinical data that you will need to provide, can provide then long-term confidence. And it's also a protection against price erosion due to competition, and a potential to obtain initial market access through innovation funding in the different markets. So if it's real innovation, then you can go after those funding mechanisms, and you get a high final ASP. But obviously you lose time to market because there's no product code, no procedure code available. You need to go through all those procedures and to get access, and you will need a high level of clinical data to prove the benefit for the patients, and often also health economic data. And here, again, the choice of comparator is really paramount. It costs, obviously, to get all that clinical data together and to address all the market access issues. And there's, as I said, no immediate reimbursement. There's a loss of time to market. Incremental innovation, the positive is that you have product and procedure codes that are already available. You would like probably to have a higher ASP, but the comparison, you need to compare to the existing products on the market, and to do so, you would need to get additional clinical data proving that actually your device is better and provides additional patient benefit. An easier use or more lean use or is usually not sufficient. Technical criteria are usually not sufficient to get an additional payment. So you really need good clinical data to prove that it's a benefit for the patient. So again, this costs money, and obtaining obviously the additional payment takes time. So if you consider your device or if it is a Me Too product, yeah, then obviously there's procedure codes already available and immediate market access in most of the countries, apart from for some types of devices, France and Belgium, where you need anyhow to demonstrate the clinical efficacy and the safety of the device. It is definitely a less burdensome submission process than to go for either full innovation or incremental innovation or increased ASP. So repeat. So for new product introduction and coverage so to define very well your choice of strategy, you really need a good market access due diligence. So understand the market you're going into, the disease area, define a rough ASP goal, obviously your strategy will also depend on the timelines that you've defined, and it's important to also set well-defined understanding of also the business leaders in your company of the time you need to get decent market access conditions. You need to have a clear choice of product positioning. Is it innovation, as we discussed before? Is it first line, second line? What's your patient group? Who will benefit? How can the advantages be sold to the decision makers? And which data do you need? And there, I don't think I need to say that, but there the collaboration, the really working together between clinical, regulatory, and market access strategy is people and strategy is really paramount, because you can develop a fantastic market access strategy, but if the clinical data doesn't follow and doesn't sustain that strategy, then it's all lost effort. So here is just a small example on, and it's from a case that I actually lived in. I can't obviously say which device or which company it concerns, but take a device that is used in quantities. So if you need for indication A 50 grams of that device for treatment, 3 treatments needed per patient, and you have 10,000 patients. And in the indication B, you need 0.5 grams, 3 treatments, and 1,000 patients. So the logical first choice for business may be to go for the first indications, because there you say, well, okay, we're going to sell more. There's more patients, so we're going to sell more. But when you go into the market access strategy, and you say, okay, with that strategy, I have my clinical data for indication A, and there I can obtain 1,000 euros for 50 grams, which means a budget of 30 million euros, yeah, for a set country. But then when you go with indication B, for which you need for only 0.5 grams per patient per treatment, there you will have even a hard time in selling your product for 100 euros per patient, and that means a budget of 300K. While if you start your strategy with indication B, and you could obtain 1,000 euro for a half a gram, you have a budget of 3 million for your first small patient population. But then when you go to your second indication, the health authorities will actually think you are doing them a favor by selling them the product at 10,000 euros for 50 grams. So it's just it's obviously a very, very easy example, but it's really to underline that you really need to think about all the implications of a choice, and even of a choice of the first indication in which you would be investing. Not saying that you need to always invest in the smallest indication, but think about the all the possible implications of the choice you're making. We talked about the 27 countries, 27 healthcare systems, and HTA, and I would like to zoom in on HTA just for a moment. So health technology assessment, as you probably all know already, is a multidisciplinary process that summarizes the information from your clinical data, from the available clinical data, about the medical, social, economic, and ethical issues related to the use of that health technology. And so it's really a systematic, transparent, and unbiased and robust manner to look at the clinical data. And it should be actually it can be applauded, because it's quite a robust and an objective way to decide on on whether a treatment is worth to be invested on or not. So it strengthens really the scientific foundation of the decision makers at different level. So next slide. And if everybody was doing HTA in the same way, that would be fantastic. But as you can see, there's an over Europe, there are really an amount of health technology assessment agencies, and in each country or in several countries there are several agencies. So for instance, in Italy you have the centralized AGENAS, and then you have regional health technology assessments, and you have even hospital health technology assessments. So you cannot end up for the same therapy with several HTAs, and each time several outcomes. In Spain, the same. You have the centralized agency in Madrid, the Carlos Tercero agency, and then all other regional and hospital HTA agencies. And there is very big heterogeneity in between assessments and between the ways in which it is set up. So, for instance, the timing in France, you will have an assessment of the clinical data at market entry. It can, and in other countries like Germany, you don't know whether the technology is ever going to be assessed, but it's anyhow normally at a later stage. The stakeholders in the process, either everybody can be a stakeholder, like for instance in the UK, anybody can be a stakeholder and can give input into the process, while in the Netherlands or in Austria, only the physicians and the payers can have a say into the process, not the industry. The outcomes that are being considered can be either patient benefit only, or other agencies can accept also intermediate outcomes or surrogate outcomes. And for what the outcomes is concerned, for instance, the IQWiC is known as being the big outlier of the group, where they for instance, for a treatment for lung emphysema, they do not want to look at the volume of breath in 1 second, so the FEV1, but only look at outcomes such as 6-minute walk distance and MMRC, so the dyspnea. Economic outcomes are sometimes considered, not always, and not by all agencies. And then the evolution of devices over time are also not always considered or taken into account. So to go back to our example where you can have incremental innovations, it's sometimes difficult to get that into the HTAs. Comparators can be a moving target. It can differ between countries, and can be unethical. It can be unethical to do a randomized control trial compared to some comparators. So there you need to be more inventive on the type of trials that can be done. Some authorities accept subgroup analysis when it's done post hoc. Others completely ignore those type of assessments. In for some authorities, there's possibilities for a hearing, for instance, in France. In other countries, there is not, or you're not even aware about the outcomes of the HTA, like for instance in Austria. And the impact on funding is not always very clear. It's not a straight line from a positive assessment to I'll get any immediate funding. It's actually the reverse is quite often much more clear. If the assessment is negative, it's quite clear you won't get funding. So different organizations, different structures, different scopes. To go a bit more into the detail of the of some of the national agencies, which you see here, and I'll go directly to the next slide. So here you have for each of the different agencies whether the manufacturer can request or submit an make a submission. So in the UK you can, in Germany no, in France you can, in Italy no, Spain not either, in Belgium you can make a submission, in the Netherlands not, and in Sweden sometimes yes, sometimes not. And also the impact from the manufacturer, so the feedback that you can give. So you see that it's very diverse from one agency to another. So it's important to understand the environment, and there where the industry or the manufacturer doesn't have direct input into the HTA agencies or the assessors, it's very important to develop your network with key opinion leaders and to make sure that they can defend your interests into the process. As I said, there can be very different data that can be assessed and different outcomes. Here it is an example for endobronchial valves for emphysema treatment. Those were evaluated in the UK in 2013 with a negative assessment, and then, well, negative, half negative. It was audit and research, so the treatment could be used, but it was a registry needed to be held. The UK looked at FEV1, quality of life, exercise, dyspnea, survival. Cost effectiveness was not a consideration in that evaluation, and they looked at RCTs and other trials. In 2017, they reviewed the evidence and then came to a positive, fully positive decision. In Germany, on the contrary, they looked only at RCTs, and they didn't look at FEV1, which was a primary outcome in 5 RCTs. So they looked at symptoms, quality of life, exercises, cognitive abilities, 6-day home 6-day. Cost effectiveness was again not considered, but their assessment became much less positive, even if there were 5 RCTs, because they just did not consider the primary outcome out of those 5 trials. And then in France, again, it's a submission done by the company, and they look at the same data as the UK, and RCTs as well as other studies. For Belgium, for instance, the KCE, which is the National HTA's agency, looked at the technology in 2009. But then in 2019, upon the request from the company, the INAMI did the assessment and came to a positive decision. So they didn't look really at cost effectiveness data, but a very important part of the evaluation was the budget impact. And then, yeah, this all the other countries evaluated the treatment too. Interesting in Sweden is that they made an assessment in 2013, and the company could not have any input or introduce any request to get that assessment reviewed, so that had to go through their quite slow internal process. Next slide. Okay, now I pushed twice, sorry. So yeah, to wrap up, I think in a market access strategy, when addressing Europe, you really need to remember that there's different countries, different healthcare systems, and it's very important to do your due diligence, to very well understand the different markets, set your north, set your goal, and have an early and a long-term strategy. See that the clinical data that is being, the clinical strategy that is being developed really matches your market access strategy. So knowledge of the environment, early and long-term strategy, preparation is important, and availability of clinical data to support the market access strategy is really key. Yeah, it's just a repetition as a conclusion. So choice on the project positioning, the choice on the comparator, patient population, etc., will determine your market access possibilities. And don't think about these elements at the end. Get prepared, get your clinical strategy in line with what you want to do for market access. Thank you. So make sure you're prepared, and I'm ready for the questions.
Thank you, Bridget, for the great and comprehensive presentation. Now we can begin to answer the questions. We have probably time for the couple of questions, but please don't forget to submit your questions, because we can still follow up with you by emails. So you still have an opportunity to submit your questions through the questions page. So I'll read the first question we have received to Bridget. Do you experience how far and often evidence generated for CE mark were enough for market access? What is a major gap you observed?
Okay, yeah. So your CE mark will, and especially until recently, will is a proof that the product works. It does what it says it does, and it's safe. But the part that is usually missing is really what is the benefit for the patient, and that's often not enough in the data that usually are submitted for just for CE mark. Also some of the studies, even for FDA approval, may not address enough the requirements for European healthcare authorities, which is really what's the benefit for the patient, what's the benefit that it can bring to society, how can it reduce overall healthcare costs. Those are the kind of questions that usually are not answered or may not be answered by those studies.
Thank you. I'll read the second question. How would your framework differ for, let's say, a novel diagnostic device such as liquid biopsy for the disease detection that is powered by machine learning capabilities?
So how would I address? Can you just repeat the start of the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I'll read it again. How would your framework differ for a novel diagnostic device such as liquid biopsy for disease detection?
Okay, so it would not. In the initial phase, so you still need to do your due diligence. So you really need to understand the market, the existing reimbursement for the diagnostic that is being done now, and determine what are the advantages of the new diagnostic. Obviously, the benefit you can bring to patients will depend on the sensitivity and how far you can avoid other diagnostics, and that's what you need to. So in your value framework, in developing on what am I bringing, what can I sell to the decision makers, that's the part of the data that you're gonna really need to develop, and based on the knowledge you have gathered on what's being done today compared to what's going to be done with the new technology.
Thank you, Bridget. I think we have time for one more last question. Do you think the new clinical evidence required by MDR will better support reimbursement application? If so, for all devices or just for my high risk one, like 2B or 3, class 2B, class 3?
Yeah, probably only for those devices that need to produce more clinical data. And yes, until now there was, especially for Me Too products, there was very few clinical data when the devices were coming to the stage where they needed to be reimbursed. So indeed, if there's with the MDR, there will be more and more high-level clinical data available. That process will be easier, but it will be even more important to when those trials are being developed. So at the early stage, before even that the trial is done. So when the trial is being planned, is to plan in to collect some additional data points on what the benefit for the patient is, eventually to push in some EQ5D data collection, so that you're sure that you will be addressing the data that will be required by the health authorities for reimbursement.
Thank you, Bridget. And I would like to thank everyone for attending our today's webinar. And on behalf of Cytel, thank you very much for joining us today, and have the great rest of your day.